When I was in college, like almost everybody who was serious about writing, and thought they might themselves be writers, I thought that writing was 95% genius, and there was this 5% was just, you had to write about something, so the other 5% was this clay that you fooled around with. And that's why I think there are so many terrific young poets. As a matter of fact, I want to get into a bit of this later this afternoon. Because poetry is the music of literature, and just the playing with words can do just marvelous things when it's used as music. But then you reach a certain age and you realize that the ball game in terms of prestige in literature is now prose. Whether that's good or bad, it's the way things are. And at that point, you find the young writer cannibalizing his life. Let's say he's 22, 23, 25, and he writes his first novel. It may be great because his life, everybody's life, has great material. In fact, Emerson said, every person on this earth has a great story to tell if only he can figure out what is his unique experience. But he didn't say everyone has two. He said everyone has one. So now the second novel comes along, and that's when you get this kind of pathetic novel. It's about a young novelist who had a great critical success with his first book, but he really didn't make any money. And he's living on this 4-story walk-up in the Clinton area of New York, and he doesn't have a girlfriend, and he can't take people out to dinner, and you know, and this is not a really terrific novel. I mean, nobody really cares about his fate after his great critical success, and yet the writing programs where you get the Masters of Fine Art in Writing, always telling people to write what you know, and students interpret that to mean your own life. Unless you count Tolstoy, there's not that much in your own life. I'd be out with a cup if I had to write surely what's based on my own life. But in the 19th century, where there were so many great realistic novelists, they understood you had to go outside of your own life to get new material. Even Dostoevsky, we think of him being such a internal psychological creative force. When he wanted to write about the student radicals of his era, he went to the archives, and then started going to, when he'd hear about a meeting of some of these groups, he'd go to get to just get the material. Dickens was, of course, famous for this. Zola did it just time after time after time, going to a new area of life. He wanted to get all of France into a series of novels, and he pretty well did. He'd go from farming to warfare to whatever he thought he really hadn't covered yet. And so when I became involved in what eventually was known as the new journalism as soon as I got to New York. I still had in my mind I was going to write novels. But this new journalism, which was writing nonfiction using devices of the novel and still being accurate in a journalistic sense, was so exciting. And there were people like Jimmy Breslin and Gay Talese who were doing it, and many others, that I just wasn't interested particularly in the novel until after I'd done The Right Stuff, which was nonfiction, and I had written it like a novel. It's the first time in my life I ever had a little cushion of money, and I decided this was a good time. If I ever was to sit down and write a novel, this was the time to do it because I could afford it. Because always in the back of your mind, those people are saying, boy, this nonfiction stuff is the most elaborate writer's block I've ever heard of. You don't tackle the big one because you've discovered this new thing that's that's supposedly better. So it was at that point that I started The Bonfire of the Vanities. And at first it was going to be a novel about New York. It had no real focus. It was going to be based more or less on Thackeray's Vanity Fair, hence the title, The Bonfire of the Vanities. And I thought I'd been a reporter for all those years here in New York, and I thought I could just draw up on my experiences, things I'd seen, and write this book, and I found I couldn't. For the way I wanted to write a novel, I had to go out and do reporting just like the reporting that I did for The Right Stuff, for the electric Kool-Aid acid test, or anything else that I had written. And the example that really got to me was when I decided I should have a great party scene in a party of great social wattage in a Fifth Avenue apartment in this book. And I'd been to a number of parties like that. And so I said, at last I don't have to do any research for this. So I wrote this chapter, and then I read it over, and it was like a gossip column. Just who's that person, what did he say, what did she say? So the next one I went to, I just shut up. I was just on the receiving end of whatever was going on. And for the first time, I noticed the strained, willfully raucous laughter that goes on at parties like that. People laugh in this frantic manner as if to say, see, I'm a part of all this. And I know it's funny, and I'm just having the time of my life because I fit in. And then I'd noticed that the worst fate in the world was not to be in a conversational cluster. And if somebody's left out, you'd see them studying the paintings as if they were really fascinated with art. They talk to empty spots on the wall. If at last resort, they'll go up to a wife or a husband and start conversation. But you've already lost the game if you reduce to doing that. There were so many things that I saw once I didn't. I was not a participant. I was just there. I noticed that at that time, and we're talking about the 1980s, in an apartment of great social wattage, there was never modern lighting. There were no downlighters, which is essentially industrial lighting. It was always, you're in sometime in the 19th century. Everything's overstuffed. There are these sort of small amber lamps that make everybody's complexion look pretty good. And I just never would have noticed any of this from my own experience. And I discovered that if my radar isn't on, if I haven't switched it on, I don't notice any more than anybody else does. I think the American dream is very much alive, and that's why there's incredible immigration to this country. The idea is that no matter where you start out, you have the freedom to go reach the height that your ability will enable you to do that. And the New York Times has just run a long series about class in America. They don't even realize they're not talking about class. They're talking about status. I mean, when they have an article, one of the articles is about some evangelical Christians who somehow have come into money and they know enough to go to Ivy League colleges, and they're making inroads at Brown and so forth and so on. That's class? These people have moved up. It's your status. They've improved their status through hard work. And the entire series, to have class, real class that was understood in Marx's day, you almost have to have a land-based economy. People have to be pretty static. And there has to be symbolism. There have to be a sense that in one class you cannot wear, in a lower class you cannot wear what they wear in a higher class. There's a certain kind of obeisance you have to make to people who are above you, and all of that is gone in this country. You'll notice that during the 60s, when there were all the student protests, everything was against the middle class. I never heard a single outcry against the upper class, because there really isn't any upper class in the European sense. And also, today, for example, it's true that if you went to Harvard or Yale yourself, your children have a better chance than the children of somebody who didn't come out of that background. But it's far from being a class thing, because even if your children the family has been 3 generations, which you really don't find much of that, but if it's been 3 generations at Harvard, let's say, you're not automatically in. They still have to reach a certain threshold in SATs and all the rest of it. I mean, I can cite you 10 cases of this. It's far from automatic. And, where are they, for example, where are the Astors today? Where are the Vanderbilts? What are they running? The Rockefellers have lasted pretty long. I think they still have a state senator somewhere. I mean, a senator from Arkansas. But these families are more like the Chinese rule of from rags to riches and to rags in 3 generations. There just are not dynasties in this country, except for dynasties that last about, like an Enron dynasty, may last 7 years. I'll tell you how calm it was in the 1930s when I was growing up. There was a state fair that was just about 3/4 of a mile from where I lived, in an area of Richmond, Virginia, called Sherwood Park. And it was the biggest gathering of human beings annually in the state of Virginia, the state fair. At 6 in the morning, my mother would give me 12 nickels. And I and one of my elementary school classmates, I guess we were 8, 9, 10 years old, would walk through the woods to the state fair. And we'd arrive at 6:30, even before the rides were really getting going, and stay there all day. The 12 nickels would get us through the day. And never was there a thought of this being dangerous. Now in Richmond, Virginia today, I'm sure that's not even in Richmond is that true. Nobody lets children go anywhere unattended. Also, I can remember riding a bicycle way into the night with my friends. I say way into the night, 9 or 10 p.m. We'd be let out of the house in the morning, and the only instruction was to be back for lunch. And I was not conscious of the depression, which was hitting Virginia and the whole country very hard, except occasionally a tramp, that's a name you never hear anymore, a word you never hear anymore, would come to the kitchen door, and my mother would give him a sandwich. I don't remember her ever turning anyone away. And somehow tramps knew what houses, I don't know how they marked it, but they apparently would mark which houses would give you food. And we were also only about 3/4 of a mile from the railroad tracks, the big north-south railroad tracks. So I'm telling you, this was an absolutely completely different era. My father was a scientist, an agricultural scientist, an agronomist, technically. And at the time I was first aware of what he did, he was editing a farm magazine called The Southern Planter. He didn't think of himself as a writer. he was a scientist, and he took over this publication because it gave advice to farmers. But in my mind, he was a writer because I'd see him at home sitting at his desk, this yellow legal pads, writing these articles, and then 2 weeks later, I think the thing came out every 2 weeks, there it would all be in this pristine, beautiful type. At that age, it's funny that I can so well remember that everything looks new. Comic strips were just wonders. I mean, they were so different from looking at one when you get older. Anyway, and my mother mostly took care of me and my sister, although she had been, when she had been married for, I think it was 7 years, and she hadn't had children. She went to medical school at the University of Richmond, and as soon as she went to medical school and been there one semester, she had started having children. I don't know what this says about medicine, biology, or anything else. But my father then went. I can remember the day he made the decision. He then went with a classmate of his. They'd gone to Virginia Tech in starting a farmers cooperative, which is a setup in which farmers buy things at wholesale price, and any profits are redistributed literally in the form of checks to everyone who bought anything according to how much they bought. It was a godsend in the 30s. I think the first year the gross revenue of that company was about $800,000. And by and by was a Fortune 500 company, still getting tax exemptions for being a co-op. And my father said, this actually isn't right. Shouldn't be getting it. But that's what he did. I read all the time. You have to remember, the only distraction or alternate entertainment in those days was radio. And people would sit around the radio. I can remember it just the way they would sit around the television set today. There was Jack Benny. Bob Hope had a program. There were the same soap operas in the morning, except we couldn't see the people. And in the afternoon, I remember they were late in the afternoon. Sort of cowboy. Tom Mix was one of the shows, and no, Batman came on. No, there was Green Hornet in those days. Anyway, it was just like television, but it just happened to be radio. So there was one great show called "I Love a Mystery," which in the program the action always started at night. And you could hear the chimes ring, and you knew it was night. And then all sorts of scary things would take place. But reading was the sort of thing you did in idle hours if you didn't want to go out and play or just things. So I just read constantly. And I'm sure if I was that age today, I'd be watching as much television as anybody else. But it's a huge advantage if you're writing, and if you ever start writing. And I began to notice when I was working on magazines years later that I kept looking over my shoulder for the new talent that would be coming along, and which would be competition for those of us who had reached the ripe age of 37 or 8, and it wasn't there. It just never got there. And part of it is that today, I think so many talented writers want to go into television, or they want to go into movie writing. Those are the hot industries. But without that reading, I don't think anybody's ever going to turn out to be much of a writer. Now, my daughter, Alexandra, who's 24 now, she went to a very tough all-girls school here in New York. And that school was so hard. She watched exactly 1 hour of television a week, not because my wife and I said, you can't go near that set. We never said that. It was she would watch Beverly Hills 90210. That was the only thing she ever watched on television. And she read and read. So today she's 24 and she's got a book contract. She's worked on 2 newspapers. She worked on the New York Observer, a weekly here in New York, and she worked on, was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and then publishing house approached her and gave her this book contract. And I think it's because partly because she read. It was, didn't get to the point where she didn't care about television. Didn't want to get news on the internet, which is the main way news is distributed these days. Even television is on, network television is on the way out. There's more advertising. I just read this today. There's more advertising now on Google and one other search engine than there is on all of network television. I loved the Wizard of Oz books. There was a whole series of Oz books. But before that, I remember reading Tales of King Arthur. I have no idea who wrote that, but it seemed to me it was awfully good. I used to also like to read nonfiction. I can remember reading Count von Luckner, the Sea Wolf. He was a German submarine commander in the First World War, who was apparently very dashing and courageous figure. The first time I started reading things like novels, I was probably 14 or 15. And my first great discovery in my mind was James T. Farrell, who had written the Studs Lonigan books. You don't hear anything about them much anymore, but the first volume of their 3 Studs Lonigan books, it's a trilogy. And the first one, which is called Young Lonigan, is so beautifully lyrical. Farrell is thought of as a kind of plodding naturalist today, if he's thought of at all. But that was an extraordinary book. And it was about a boy about my age, and it just opened up all sorts of possibilities. Yes, I had, from a very early age, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old, because of my father. I thought of him as a writer. He thought of himself as a scientist. Although, interestingly enough, he has more entries in the New York Public Library than I do, because he wrote so many monographs in the field of agronomy. It's interesting. I dare say he did more good for humanity. He did things like discover how you could quadruple or increase tenfold the yield of corn was one of his specialties. This was back at a time when that was an exciting industry. This country was discovering ways to make America bountiful in terms of crops, wheat, corn, all those sort of things. You don't realize how interesting your family is until you get much older and you look back. I remember Thomas Wolfe, my namesake. Turned out we're no kin. We're from the same mountain range and everything. We are no kin, but he once said that he grew up thinking that he was in the most banal, boring, grind-along family that had ever existed. He said, I was 23 or 24 when I first realized I was living with a group of raging lunatics. And you can see this in Look Homeward, Angel. I mean, this is a family in turmoil, largely because of the excessive drinking of the father and the fact that his mother's turned the house into a boarding house, and his constant flow of boarders who've come to Western North Carolina for the nice air and the cool air in the summertime. Well, my family was anything but raising lunatics, but when I look back at how hard it all was in the middle of the Depression, it was just a horrible time. And particularly when I look back at the emphasis that was completely on education. My father's family apparently came to the Shenandoah Valley from somewhere north of there in the early 1700s. And nobody ever made any money that would catch your attention. But for 6 generations back, there are graduate degrees. The first, my full name is Thomas Kennerly Wolfe, and the first person in the Wolfe family named Thomas Kennerly Wolfe went to the University of Edinburgh to study. Where the money came from, I don't know. My father's father, who was a country doctor, died when my father, I think, was 12. And his mother had 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls, out of the 10 who had been born. Infant mortality was terrible. And all 3 of the boys went to graduate school. One had higher degrees. One was a lawyer, one was a medical doctor, and my father had a PhD in agronomy. Where that money came from, I don't know. But I just love the fact that it didn't care about the money. The thing was, get an education. In kindergarten, there was a teacher named Miss Shackelford, I always called her. I honestly cannot remember her first name, although I saw her years later, who took a special interest in me very early, which made me feel very special, made me feel like, well, maybe I can really do things with these words and so on, and ended up combining my kindergarten and first grade into 1 year, which I don't really advocate because you end up being smaller, a year younger than the people you're competing with. But anyway, she got me off to a good start. In high school, there was a course in the sophomore year of high school in rhetoric. And I'm talking about rigorous rhetoric, the use of figures of speech, figura sententiae, and tropes, and all these technical names, and training in the 3 or 4 ways that you can arrange a paragraph. I don't think any of this happens any longer. Parsing sentences, which is a fading art. You do these diagrams of sentences, so you find out how all the different parts fit together. This was amazingly good training. Then in college, I went to Washington Lee in Virginia. There was a young professor. It never dawned on me till later that he was probably only 4 or 5 years older than me, who had come to Washington Lee from the American Studies program at Yale. That's where he'd gotten his doctorate. And that course was so exciting that I was determined to do what he had done, which is to go to Yale in American Studies, which I did. That particular course was called American Intellectual History. And so we went through every branch that might fall under that heading you can think of, everything from philosophy to architecture, to psychology. I mean, to study William James and figures like that. It was just, to me, tremendously exciting. So I managed to get into that program at Yale, which turned out to be a terrific choice for somebody who wants to write. A bad choice if you want to, as I was going to do, be a teacher. because there are not that many American Studies departments, and a lot of the people who graduate from that program would end up at the bottom of the heap in somebody's history department or English department. But it's absolutely great for writers. I discovered sociology there, which was like a light bulb going on over my head. Like most liberal arts students, I'd always look down my nose at sociology as this kind of bogus science. When I finally had to deal with it in graduate school, I quickly came to the conclusion, which I maintain to this day, that it is in fact the queen of the sciences. I won't get into this, but biology in my mind is a subset of sociology, not the other way around. My first great real flash was reading the work of Max Weber, who did The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He wrote Class, Status, and Caste, Class, Caste, and Status, many other, mostly essays, but he's the one who originated the concept of status as a motivating force in life. And it was one of those things that's under everybody's nose, but he gave it a name. And the reason I call it status instead of status is that at the Yale Graduate School, status had more status if you call it status. And I can't get that out of my mind now. I still call it status, thinking, hey, maybe somebody from Yale's listening. Anyway, my belief is that everyone, me included, I hate theories that don't apply to the person who thought up the theory. All people live by what I call a fiction absolute, which is a set of values which, if absolute, in other words, if God said, hey, here are the values, and you heard the voice clearly, would make not you, yourself, but your group, your status group, whatever they may be comprised of, the best there is. For example, a group of good old boys sitting around a general store in the South, and I've been around that a lot, they usually, things can get confused this era, but they usually are very content to be good old boys. And they not only content, but they value that life very, very highly. People who are obviously their superiors, or in my case, my superiors, military people, politicians, President of the United States, movie stars, whatever, they become types who are not part of your, not really outside of your life. And whatever they're doing doesn't matter, unless they move in the neighborhood, and that creates real problems, it really does. And so that just about everything, I think everything we do is controlled by that constant need to feel that our status is being kept at a certain level. It doesn't mean necessarily status climbing. It usually doesn't mean that. It more often means believing that what you're doing now, the people you're with now, are the values you have now are the most important. I swallow it all very easily. The idea that, oh, this writing is really important. But you can get split by a career. On the one hand, I'm thinking that, geez, there's probably not much else in the world that you can do that's more important than writing. At the same time, I am protective of my Southern upbringing. And this leads to something I call championism, which is a kind of irrational attachment to certain figures or certain cultural directions, because it represents somehow that either the group, the person, in your mind as a champion of what you believe in to maintain your fiction absolute. So many people's votes are irrationally determined by championism. I remember Samuel Lubell wrote a book called The Future of American Politics, which is he was a sociologist. He was trying to figure out why Truman had upset Dewey in 1948. Huge upset. So he went around the country in a sort of sociological survey, and he came to a town, I think it was in Wisconsin. It was a German town. It had been founded by German Catholics, and it still maintained its German majority. And they, in that election, voted Republican, right? I mean, by an enormous margin. It turned out the reason was Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, in 1917, had declared war on Germany, which in turn brought a lot of opprobrium on Germans who were in the United States. And they had never forgotten that that's what the Democrats had done. It really had nothing to do with the 1948 election. It had to do with something that happened in 1917. And I think everybody does that. I kept coming across the names of Italian-American women, all from the Third Ward in Springfield, who were getting naturalized at age 61, 62, maybe 63. I couldn't understand this. And so I went to the Third Ward, and it turned out that part of the Third Ward was like a preserved, authentic Italian village. And the people in that small part of the ward didn't want to change a thing. I mean, they were quite happy to live in the old ways. They were not at all corrupted by the world around them. But when the time, they didn't even want to be American citizens, or it wasn't important to them, unless you wanted Social Security. At that point, you get naturalized. But I thought it was such a good example of status in the sense of wanting to maintain exactly what you've got. Oh, I should throw this into another great example of championism is Muhammad Ali. There's a documentary movie, which you may have, When We Were Kings, which has deservedly become very popular as documentaries go, which did something concerning the fight that Ali had against George Foreman in Zaire, the so-called Rumble in the Jungle, that nobody in print picked up. And that was the fact that to Africans, at least certainly in Zaire, he was their champion, not just a boxing champion. He was their champion. And they presumed that his fight against George Foreman was Armageddon. It was black against white. And when Foreman stepped off the plane and he was black, they couldn't believe it. That all comes out in the movie. It's just a marvelous touch. And there's this constantly, Ali goes around, touring around Zaire, and he'll go, Ali, Boombabe! And apparently this meant long live Ali. He loved all of that, and they very much loved him. I'll give a case example in my own case. When right after 9/11, both Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, independently, I don't think they got together, and came out almost the day afterward and said, the depravity and sinfulness of the American people is what their lack of contact with God is what brought this on. That's why it happened. And of course, it was around the bend, but this tirade of disparagement is directed against these two men, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. And I found myself saying, hey, wait a minute. I know those people. Pat Robertson incidentally went to Washington and Lee, same place I went. His father had been a U.S. senator. And, you know, he's far from being stupid. I couldn't agree for a second with what he was saying, but I found myself defending him. Jerry Falwell was just maybe 75 miles down the road from Washington and Lee in Lynchburg, Virginia. And he's one of my people. You don't go around saying these people are idiots or morons or they're, it was totally irrational. I couldn't agree with the thing they said, but that's championism. It's all part of the fiction absolute I'm talking about. And I can sit here and call it a fiction absolute, and yet my life operates by it. I think everybody's does. That's what has gotten me interested in in neuroscience. When I hit upon this the whole concept of status and a status absolute and all that, I was convinced that there is a part of the brain that controls this. For example, I find that you can tell when you're humiliated before you could put it into words. Something goes off, and you haven't reasoned it all out. It's just happened, and this has to be neurological in some way. Well, I must confess, I've never found this area, although I'm an avid neuroscience buff now. I subscribe to two newsletters. They give you week by week developments in neuroscience in language that I can understand. I go to neuroscience conferences, and the field is just become enormous. The annual meetings of the American Society for Neuroscience are among the biggest in the country now. I'll give you very quickly the premise of neuroscience. There are two quick examples. One is Edward O. Wilson, who's probably the dominant theorist in neuroscience today, once said in an interview, he probably would never write this clearly, but he said, every human brain is born not as a blank slate waiting to be filled in by experience, but as a negative, as in the film from a negative in a camera, that is waiting to be dipped into developer fluid. And the idea is it can be developed well, it can be developed badly, according to the environment. But no matter how it's developed, you're not going to get any more than is on that negative at birth, which of course gets into the whole theory of genetics and things like hard wiring of the brain and so on. He's at Harvard in the his field is actually zoology. He's the great expert on ants. But his books have been the most. He invented the term sociobiology, which is a combination of the social factors whether it's among ants or macaque monkeys, or as we know, there's lots of animals pecking order among chickens. There is this interaction of status and genetics. I'll give you the other example from neuroscience. I do not know who first said this, but one of the principles of neuroscience is that if you took a rock and you threw it, and in mid-flight of that rock you gave it consciousness and powered reason, that rock would give you, until the day it hit the earth, the most cogent and absolutely ironclad logic as to why he's going this direction and to why he hasn't chosen another direction, and why he's happy with his choice. And particularly young neuroscientists believe that's what our lives are like. We're machines, and according to which other machines we run into, are we going to react in a predictable way? Right here, and they feel if they had enough computer power, so-called parallel computers, that they could predict what you're going to do 5 seconds from now. They could predict that you're going to suddenly hit your forehead with your tips of your fingers 5 seconds from now. That's how sure they are about this determination that goes on. I see it already, people believing in what I call the lurking force. Whole 20th century has trained us to think that things happen because of the lurking force. For example, Marxism, which had a huge influence in the 20th century. The theory says that the class you're born into is your destiny. So in other words, you were born into this certain class, and the forces that come from that have shaped your life. You don't have any choice. Freudianism, which was so powerful as a way of thinking about human behavior in the 20th century, holds that your destiny is an Oedipal battle that took place in your family when you were between the ages of 3 and 6 and were totally unaware of anything that was going on in any large sense. So these are both external theories. Then there are many other theories that were never quite individually as powerful that say, society shapes you in a certain way. And so you reach the point where a psychiatrist like Theodore Dalrymple, the prison psychiatrist, tells of how he was questioning a prisoner for psychiatric treatment and asked him, he was in for 18 years for aggravated manslaughter, and asked him, how did this come about that he had killed this man? And the prisoner says, well, we were at this table, we're having a few drinks, and we got into an argument. And the next thing I know, he's standing up and he's got his fists clenched, and I think he's going to hit me. So I stood up and I pulled out my knife. And then we yelled at each other some more, and things got worse. And I don't know, and then the knife went in. Now, believing, because he'd read it, that you had a chaotic childhood, and you were in kind of the wrong end of society, and these forces compel you to stick knives in people's midsections. This is part of it, and now neuroscience has made the threat seem even worse. If your genetic makeup at birth is determining so many things, I think it causes people to kind of give up on their children. Say, well, he wasn't born a student. Why knock my brains out trying to make him do something he isn't? When most people just need a camp counselor who'll kick them in the slats every now and then when the motivation drops. But this is I think it's enervating to be constantly told that there's a lurking force that is determining your life.